Hey everyone, and welcome to Dominion Cards. This is a video series where we take a strategic look at individual cards from the board game Dominion. Today we are looking at Chapel. This is a 2-cost action card from the base game, and it says trash up to 4 cards from your hand. Now, Chapel does exactly one thing, and that is trash a load of cards, but it trashes a lot of cards. It is one of the most efficient trashers in the game. It is very hard to find other cards that can trash as much as Chapel. It will thin down your deck very, very quickly. You trash so many cards all at once. You will get down to a small number of cards pretty fast when you use this. The trashing does not care about the cost of the cards that you trash, unlike some other trashers. Therefore, it's very good at trashing really low-cost stuff, like curses and coppers and estates, as an example. Chapel is incredibly strong card. This is probably one of the top 10 cards ever released. And when you consider now that the number of Kingdom cards I believe is over like 350 now that we've had Menagerie released. And that's just the cards, that's not counting all of the landscapes, the sideways things. That's really good going, you know. One of the first cards ever released. It's still up there as one of the top 10 most powerful. This is a game-warping card, and almost every kingdom that it shows up in, people often say, like, oh, this is a Chapel board or a Chapel kingdom, and that is because Chapel is so strong, and games with it tend to play very differently from games with less efficient trashing. So why is Chapel just so strong? That is because trashing is really, really good. You start every game with 10 cards, and those 10 cards tend to be very weak. Coppers and Estates are just not very good cards. That is, of course, because it's a deck builder. The aim is to improve your deck to something that's actually good. So obviously all the cards you start with, they're going to be poor, right? You don't really want the Coppers and Estates. If you get rid of them, then what you get to do is you get to draw more powerful cards that you have bought and gained since. In addition to that, some cards do very well when combined together. So like Village and Smithy are fine cards on their own, but if you draw them into the same hand, then suddenly they're a lot better, right? You can play the Village and then the Smithy, and you can keep playing more action cards. In addition to that, if you have 10 Coppers and Estates sitting around in your deck, then you have to spend a lot of cards just to draw past them. So if you consider like Laboratory, which is +2 cards and +1 action, you would need to dedicate 5 laboratories worth of draw just to get through all of the Coppers and Estates. You know, that's before we consider all the other cards that you have added since. So, you know, that's quite a lot. 10 cards is a lot of cards. And if we can get rid of those 10 starting cards, then hey, that's great for us, right? That just puts less effort on our resources to draw everything, and we get to play with the cards that we have purchased a lot more. So Chapel, despite being so incredibly strong, is actually probably one of the easiest cards to actually play with. Chapel, something that I call the Chapel formula. It's a very formulaic, a standardized way of actually playing with the Chapel card. And most games, if not all of them, that you play with Chapel will follow this standard formula. So here's how it works. Chapel, because it's so cheap, you want to purchase one on turn 1 or 2. In fact, the reason why the card is so cheap is so that you can purchase it on one of the first 2 turns. On your first 2 turns, you normally either have 3 money and 4 money, or you have 5 money and 2 money, and the order of those changes. So obviously you tend to buy the Chapel on either the 3 money or the 2 money turn. Then, when you first draw your Chapel, you want to trash all of the Coppers and Estates that you draw with the Chapel. Now, usually, hopefully, that means you will be trashing all 4 cards. You know, even though the Coppers are generating you money, you still want to trash them anyway. If you draw, say, Chapel on turn 3 with 4 coppers, do you still want to trash all of those coppers? The answer is usually yes. In fact, it's almost always yes. You just want to get rid of them on the very first use of Chapel. Because you tend to buy another card in your first 2 turns, sometimes you will draw your other purchase with Chapel. That's very sad when that happens. What happens is that you always just play the Chapel, and you're only going to be trashing 3 cards, right? Now, eventually you will draw Chapel again. In a number of cases, you will be trashing again. You may not trash everything, but and sometimes you may not want to trash, but, the second time you see Chapel, maybe you will just do another full trash of all of the coppers and estates in your hand. And then from then on, how you may never play Chapel again, or you will just play it now and then. One big problem with Chapel is that turn 5, if you draw it on turn 5, this is a problem. So once you've bought 2 cards on your first 2 turns, you now have a 12-card deck. And that means there are 2 cards, typically, that you might not draw until turn 5. And turn 5 is bad, because when you hit turn 5, you will be shuffling your deck, and that results in something we call missing the shuffle. So Chapel you had in your hand when you shuffled, so you'd already drawn it. So unfortunately, that Chapel didn't make it into the shuffle, which means that you're going to have to shuffle yet again until you see that Chapel a second time. Having Chapel miss the shuffle and turn up on turn 5 in some games can actually be so bad that you have effectively just lost the game there and then, if it's a particularly powerful kingdom. The reason for that is because you just slows down your trashing so much. You had to reshuffle your deck before you had a chance to take 4 bad cards out of it, so it would take you even longer to find your Chapel for a second time. And it's just, the tempo is just lost so much. But anyway, that's sort of how Chapel works, and that's generally always how you use it. Chapel, the reason why we open it and why we follow this formula is because when you are playing Chapel, ideally, you want to take advantage of the fact that it trashes so many cards. It's so much easier to trash a load of junk cards when you have a deck that is filled with junk cards. And if you consider all the cards you start with are junk cards, and obviously at the start of the game is when you have the highest density of poor cards. Because before the game starts, all of your cards are weak, right? All of your starting cards are bad. Another reason why Chapel is so good compared to other trashers, so there are other trashers that only trash like 1 or 2 cards at a time. Actually, most trashers are like this. So if you consider, for example, Steward from Intrigue, it can trash 2 cards from your hand. Now, when you trash coppers from your hand, that means you are not playing that copper that turn and generating money from it. Copper, while I've just said so many times it's a bad and weak card, the reality is that it still generates you a bit of money. And if you trash it from your hand on a turn, then, well, it's not giving you money that turn. And usually when you are playing something like Steward that trashes 2 cards, your turn will be left with just like 2 coppers left in your hand. And usually that's not enough to buy something good. Like, there are some very good 2-cost cards, but usually they aren't. And that means that that's just a turn where you didn't buy anything. Well, when you trash 4 cards with Chapel, hey, that's also a turn where you're not buying anything, but you trashed twice as many cards, and so the number of turns where you will be doing that trade-off, just trashing cards and buying nothing, you will end up with less of those turns, right? That sort of period of trashing cards and not really adding anything to your deck will happen a lot less. It will be finished and over with a lot more quickly. So Chapel just sort of gets the slowness of trashing cards from your hand just out of the way really quickly, and then just lets you spend a lot more time from earlier on building back up into a really strong deck. Now, we've talked a lot about opening Chapel. on turn 1 or 2. But that means you're going to be usually buying something else with a Chapel. So what's a good thing to purchase alongside Chapel? So because Chapel is trashing all of your coppers out of your deck so quickly, the number one concern you usually have is how you're going to maintain some sort of money and buying power. So silver, for example, is a pretty common opening with Chapel. Right, you get rid of the coppers and then you have the silver left to still try and make some money with. There are other ways to make money. So, for example, Poacher from the base game is +1 card, +1 action, and +1 coin. It is nice because not only does it generate a bit of money, but also because it draws a card. If your Chapel was like the 11th card in your deck, well, now it won't happen on turn 5. Right, you will hopefully get it on turn 4 instead, because you draw it at some point with Poacher. You drew a card. Obviously, this can't guarantee this. Your Poacher and your Chapel could be the bottom 2 cards, or your Chapel could be the bottom card. But anything to try and avoid that small chance of getting a turn 5 blowout can be pretty helpful. But again, usually it wants to be a card that still generates you money. You can use terminal cards. So when people consider what 2 cards they open with, some people are very wary of trying to open with 2 action cards, neither of which has any plus actions on it, and that is because of what we refer to as terminal collision. So normally this means on turn 3 or 4, or possibly even worse, even 5, you draw 2 terminal actions together, and that means you can only play one, and the other one doesn't get played. Now with Chapel, terminal collision is not really a problem. That is because if you had used a silver with Chapel instead, and you draw them together, well, you're probably not going to be using the silver for anything on that turn 3 or 4, right? You're just going to use the Chapel to trash the other 3 junk cards, and then you could buy a 2 cost, but if there isn't any other good 2 costs, the silver just went to waste. So terminal collisions are not as much of a problem with Chapel. You always just prioritise the Chapel. It's unfortunate if they collide, but it's not really a big deal. Terminal draw like Smithy, though, is particularly bad. That is because terminal draw has a chance right at that early part of the game of drawing your Chapel. Like if you bought a Smithy as an opener and then you played it and you draw the Chapel with the Smithy, you can't play the Chapel, and that Chapel, you essentially wasted it through your first shuffle where you had it, and that's really bad. That's like basically having the turn 5 problem, but you caused it yourself. So don't do that, right? You want to make sure that if you do go for a draw card, like maybe it was 5-2 and you took a laboratory with it or something, but even then, generally you want to consider a card that gives you money. Now, I just wanted to give a particular shout-out for Militia, which is another card from the base game. There's a card, and it gives you 2 money, but it also is an attack where each other player discards down to 3 cards in hand. Now, this is kind of important on a Chapel game, because if you can hit your opponent with this attack when your opponent has a Chapel in hand, they can't trash 4 cards anymore this turn. They can only trash 2. And that can be helpful in slowing down your opponent quite a bit in the early game. Now, Militia is a card that the first player gets more benefit out of. So a Militia Chapel opening tends to be a lot better for player 1 than player 2, but that's just how Militia works in general. And of course, there's all sorts of randomness, like your Militia could be turn 5, your Militia could hit on the turn where your opponent doesn't have Chapel, or your Militia could collide with Chapel in the opening turn, in which case you'd rather play the Chapel. But it is something to think about. Militia's a pretty good card in general anyway, and it's still giving you the early money like a silver would. So, it's if you are playing a base game or any game and you see these 2 come up, Militia Chapel can be a reasonable opening. Now, we want to talk about something called over-trashing. So because Chapel gets rid of money out of your deck so quickly, it is possible to actually trash too much money too quickly. This is something that we refer to as over-trashing. So to give you the canonical example, say you trash 8 cards and you're left with a deck that only has 2 coppers in it. Well, that's not enough money to actually buy a silver. And unless you happen to have a 2-cost card that generates you money somehow in the kingdom, the only way you are going to get more money now is that you're forced to buy a copper. And that's really bad because you just trashed a load of coppers. There's no point in trashing a load only to immediately buy it back again if you need to actually play the copper and spend it. So what you want to do is when you are playing Chapel, is you want to count how many coppers you've trashed. You don't really need to worry about keeping track of the estates. The estates are generally quite bad, and you're not playing them anyway. So you just get rid of them. But the coppers you want to watch out for. You want to consider, for example, that if you opened with a silver alongside your Chapel, if you keep 3 coppers around, then you might be able to purchase a 5-cost card. Right, you've got enough money. If you bought a silver, then you know that you can go down to 1 copper and still have enough money to buy another silver, right? In addition to that, I've got to mention it again, coppers, they actually do generate you money. And while Chapel trashes down really quickly, if you get down to the stage where you have like 3 or 4 coppers left, it's fine to leave them in your deck for a little while, right? Your deck will be so thin at that point, like those 3 coppers, your opening card and your Chapel, they might even be the only cards that you have at that point, in which case you're drawing them every turn and you're using them for a while. You can just leave them in there and then trash them later, right? But it's really important to consider the cost of the cards that you want to start adding to your deck. You don't, after trashing down and spending turns while trashing where you didn't buy anything, because you trashed all the cards in your hand, you really don't want to be spending a lot of turns after that. Just buying like basic money just to get back up to the stage where you can afford the card you want. If you had a silver and 3 coppers, that's 5 money. But if you decided, I'm going to trash 2 coppers and then buy another silver, well, on the next turn, you've still only got 5 money, right? And you've shrunk your deck size by 1 in total. But what did you really achieve? Could it not have waited a little bit? And oftentimes it probably could have, right? At that point, your deck is so small, it's not going to be hard to get to the stage where you're drawing your deck again and can then just take out the coppers when you need to. Junking attacks. So Chapel is extremely good at trashing curses and coppers, which is what a lot of junking is, because if your opponent tries to give you a load, you can just trash them all at once. In fact, Chapel is so good at trashing these that junking attacks in general can be less effective if your opponent picks up a Chapel, to the point where actually you might not want to buy any junking cards at all. Like maybe Witch isn't good anymore because your opponent has a Chapel. So if you consider that your opponent has trashed most of their deck and they've got down to a really thin deck and now they can draw their deck every turn, well, if you add a curse or 2 to their deck, that usually gets put in the discard pile. Like Witch will gain the curse to their discard pile. If they had enough draw to now be able to draw those curses on their next turn, that is basically because the curses are in their discard pile, they will draw them last. And those sorts of junk stock cards, your deck is at its most reliable when they are drawn last. So it's not like the curses would have really had a chance to actually affect their draws, because they popped up at the very end. And, if your opponent, because he has a Chapel, he draws all the cards, and then he plays the Chapel, and he just immediately trashes those curses, what did it even do? It didn't hurt your opponent at all, right? They were expecting it. They could draw them on the same turn. They got them without any impact to their reliability, and then they just immediately trashed them. In that sort of case, what's the junking attack even doing? And the answer is, well, probably nothing, right? So you probably shouldn't even bother with the junking attack in that case. But even then, even if a junking attack is still good, you still want to thin your deck first. And the reason why you want to thin your deck before you consider the junking is because it makes it so much easier to respond to junking attacks. Like, if your deck is smaller, then it's easier to draw the junk when you get given it, and it's easier to line them up with your chapel, right? So yeah, something like Witch Chapel isn't necessarily going to be a very good opening, partially because the Witch is already like terminal draw, because it draws you 2 cards when you play it, but also because the junking might not even be very good. Like, Smithy might be a better card than Witch on chapel boards. It changes, it depends on the rest of the board, but in general, junking is a lot worse when you have chapel on the board. Now, chapel, I say it's a top 10 kingdom card, and you pretty much always want it, but sometimes you don't want it. Would you believe that there actually exist things out there that trash cards more effectively than chapel? That's pretty crazy when you consider how strong chapel is, but here they are. Here are some events. There's Donate from Empires, where you pick up all of the cards you own and immediately trash any number of them on the turn that you buy it, which is just completely insane. You would ignore chapel on a board with Donate, because obviously you just use the Donate instead. Cathedral from Renaissance is a project that means that you automatically trash a card from your hand at the start of every turn. Whether or not Cathedral is better than Chapel will depend on the rest of the kingdom, but Cathedral is very strong, and I think there is an argument in a number of cases where you would rather have the Cathedral over the Chapel, and part of the reason for that is you get to start trashing cards straight away from turn 2. Right, if you buy Cathedral on turn 1, you can trash a card on turn 2, and normally by the time you would get round to your Chapel, you've already trashed an equivalent number of cards with Cathedral, but you might have had slightly better turns in the meantime, right? Instead of having a turn with Chapel where you can't actually buy anything because you've trashed all of the cards from your hand, with Cathedral you still get the opportunity to buy stuff because you're only trashing a card one at a time. And it's just that it happens regularly that means that Cathedral trashes a lot, right? It happens a lot more regularly, that small amount of trashing, so often that you actually trash down all of your junk cards fairly quickly. There are other reasons other than these insane power cards, of course. In general, you can describe Chapel as being bad in a case where your starting hand cards are all pretty good. But that really doesn't come up very often at all. I've got an example here, which is a bit of a sad example, but I think we need to talk about it. And that's something called Big Money. So I've tried in these videos to not talk about Big Money. Big Money, just to give you the gist of it, this is a strategy that the community refers to, where you're basically only buying the defaults, treasures, and victory cards that are in every game. So your golds, your silvers, and your duchies and provinces. And Big Money just is not very good at all. Back in the days of the first edition base game, some of the cards in there was enough density of only terminal actions, and many of them were quite weak. A lot of these got removed in the second edition, but what it did mean was that actually Big Money, sometimes it really actually was the best thing to do. I mean, it still happens occasionally on some boards. Some boards are just unbelievably weak. The Kingdom cards that come up just don't match at all, and there's really nothing to do. But it doesn't happen very often, particularly in two-player games, which we tend to focus strategy on. And in Big Money, the coppers are actually, you are using the coppers both to bloat your deck up and also because they are giving you money. So if you consider taking Big Money and adding one card to it, Chapel tends to be a lot worse than most other cards. So like the typical is like Smithy is very good with Big Money. Chapel with Big Money actually loses to Big Money that doesn't add anything else to it. So that's just something to keep in mind. But this is, the odds that you're going to come up to a big money board with Chapel these days, with all the expansions out, is incredibly low in 2-player, so you probably don't really need to worry about it. I think I've already spent too long talking about it. Other examples are some very weird and peculiar combos of cards that are just very powerful, that create these really strange decks that don't play like anything else. So Beggar Gardens is one. Gardens comes from the base game. There's a victory card that scales up as you own more cards in your deck. And Beggar is an action card, essentially, that gains you 3 coppers directly to your hand when you play it. And so that just gets you so many coppers so quickly. And the Gardens, you actually want to keep the cards. Gardens is normally not so great. I'll do a video on it soon, I'm sure. But, it's really good with Beggar just because it earns so many cards. Counting House and Travelling Fair is another one. So Counting House from Prosperity draws all of the coppers in your discard pile. And Travelling Fair essentially lets you buy cards with money, exchange your money for extra buys and top deck stuff. And Counting House Travelling Fair is a combo where you buying and top decking a Counting House and a bunch of coppers every turn, and then on the next turn you draw them all again, and you just get increasingly large amounts of money until all the Counting Houses run out. It's another very, very strange board, but on that you would also ignore Chapel because it's very strong and very quick. I need to mention that in games with more than 2 players, engine boards, what we call engines, games where you are like trashing down and then buying villages and smithies and drawing and doing all this stuff, they get a lot worse. Part of the reason why they get worse is because there are less cards to go around per player, so 3 piles can empty and you have less cards available to you to make a good engine. But also there are things like king making, and if 2 players are going for some strategy that drains the pile quickly, you may find that Chapel just ends up too slow. The game just ends really fast. But generally, it's hard to talk a lot about strategy for games with more than 2 players because individual people have much less of an impact on those games. And, it's difficult. It's a lot more random. Games tend to be shorter because piles run out quicker. And in the case of 4 or more players, there are literally less provinces to go around per player, so the game actually ends sooner. And that harms the strategies that try to build something that builds up for longer and then has a more explosive payoff later on. They just sort of get worse. So Chapel encourages you to build decks like that, and so Chapel can be worse then. But I can't talk too much about that. It's too hard to give specific advice about that. One last thing I do want to go through. There are some events around there that are really, really good with Chapel because they let you play the Chapel on turn 2. So here's Travelling Fair. This is the card I was just talking about on the last slide. If you have 4 or 5 on your very first turn, on turn 1, you can purchase Travelling Fair, and then you've got enough money left over to buy Chapel, and you can put it on top of your deck. So that means you can play it straight away on turn 2. Summon, which is a promotional card, which you buy from the Board Game Geek store. This is if you have 5... you can play it and you gain a Chapel and you set it aside and then you play it on turn 2 automatically. This is a lot harder to make use of than Travelling Fair because not only do you have to get the rarer 5-2 opening, but the 5 turn has to come sooner. Like these things here with Travelling Fair and Summon and Demand, they're only really good if the 4 or the 5 card turn happens on turn 1. Because they let you play the Chapel on turn 2. And lastly, Demand from Menagerie. Again, you get to gain a card and put it on top of your deck with Chapel. Obviously, playing Chapel on turn 2 is really powerful because it lets you trash 4 cards before you do the first shuffle, which is just an incredible speed up. And on these ones as well, like particularly with Summon and Demand, if you had the 5 card hand on turn 1, then you know that the next hand is going to be the 2-cost hand, which is going to have 3 estates in it. So it allows you to get rid of all of your estates on turn 2, which is just absolutely ridiculously strong. So you do have to watch out for these, even though they are even when they do show up with Chapel, it then has a further luck requirement, so you don't necessarily see them that often, but it's definitely worth keeping in mind. And that's really it for Chapel. So Chapel is a card that if you've ever looked up strategy for Dominion before, you probably already know about Chapel. That's because it's so easy to play, but it's also so incredibly strong. It's very easy to make a strategy about, you massively improve your win rate just by understanding the basics of Chapel and why it is good. This is like a fundamental thing to understand about Dominion, is why the trashing is just so strong. And nothing really exemplifies that more than Chapel, which just lets you have these incredibly trimmed down and efficient decks much, much faster than most other things do. Now, normally in these videos, this is the stage where I generate some random kingdoms to look at, and we see how the card that we're talking about, what impact it has on those kingdoms. But there's not really any point in this video. The reason why is because it's a base card, so I would have just generated some base-only games. And in 2-player 2nd edition base-only games, if Chapel is on the board, you follow that formula. You purchase it on turn 1 or 2. And when you first see it, you trash all of your starting cards in that hand. So there's really nothing to show. Just imagine that I generated a random kingdom, and I said, do we use Chapel on this board? Yes. And then I moved on to the next, and we just repeat that 5 times. So rather than waste your time with that, I think I'll just end this video here. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time. Thank you and goodbye.